All right, I'm back, and I'm trying to get all these getting to know series done probably in one day here. Um, I've got really three more people to recommend, but I'm going to try to do it in two episodes. Okay, the first will be done on one individual. The second I'm going to do on two men combined, kind of together. So the Getting to Know You series is basic. Getting to Know series, sorry. The Getting to Know series is basically kind of a 10-minute video on trying to recommend and commend certain Christians to people. Now, there are many to commend, but these are more kind of considered historically great Christians that are both leaders in their thinking and their life. Now, not everyone's life is perfect. Please don't take it like that. But these people have a life that's worth commending. Not sinless. We're not saying that. We're not saying that they didn't have all their own problems. Okay, we do too. But we're recommending their thought and their life to you because they're historically seen to be people that are commendable. Okay, so not just great people in the way they live, but they're great in the way they've thought too, and how they understand the Christian faith too. So there's a lot to commend. Okay, so for the fourth episode, I want to share with you about the Christian Jonathan Edwards. And Jonathan Edwards is typically understood to be kind of this firebrand kind of pastor, and this kind of kind of ridiculous caricature of Puritans. And I think if you start to read about his life and those things, you'll find that those things they're just not true. Okay, in fact, I've got a friend who's doing his doctorate right now on Jonathan Edwards. And I get to read kind of what he's picking up all the time, and I just learn more and more just kind of following him, along with other books I've read. This is a normal pastor, a pastor that God chose to use in a mighty way, but someone who didn't have all the antics that you think and was not the firebrand that you think, but someone who's very convicted about the truth. What I find about Jonathan Edwards that is so fascinating to me, and why I commend him to you, he was alive from I think it was like 1703, maybe I'm off on that, through like 1750s. So he wasn't alive very long. Let me see his life, but yeah, I think it was just for like 50, 1705 to 1768. There it is. And so he was alive for about 60 years. And he was someone who was consistently enthralled with nature. In fact, he has a journal entry from when he was 10 years old that talked about the fascination of a spider. He's just an interesting individual in that he saw the world as God's world. He didn't see the world as just this dour and horrible place, like kind of most Christians do, which is not a biblical view. It's a world that is filled with God's glory, but it's also a fallen world. And Edwards understood that, but he also saw how God was revealed in the world. So he's an interesting individual in that way, and he understood that at a young age. He also really has an interesting take on devotion, because early in his life, when he was in his teens, he wrote a book of diary entries on resolutions. And when you're getting into college and you're starting to figure out, oh, I really want to be a Christian, I really want to live this thing out, you typically get very attracted to people that are very convicted about things. And Jonathan Edwards is one of those people. He has resolutions that he wrote, and one of those resolutions is just insane. It's like, resolved to not waste one more minute of my life, knowing that eternity is at the door, the door of the day, or something like that. Resolved not to waste one more minute of my life, knowing my life could end at any moment. That's very inspiring. I think it's also very exhausting if you really think about it very much. I don't know if everything about his life is really commendable in the sense of understanding that we're to enjoy our lives, not just wear ourselves thin. Okay, but again, that was him. Okay, so I'm just kind of saying that there's a lot of commendable things about his life, and sometimes there's some real eccentric things about his life too. I love how he was also kind of around lots and lots of ministers. His wife's husband was a minister. His father was involved in the ministry. So he was kind of coming from a ministry background, kind of like my family does. But people love to, this is really interesting to share with you before I kind of get a few minutes into his thought. But this is probably most famous picture of Jonathan Edwards. He's kind of touched up real well. He's got this wig on. He's got makeup on and things like that. Notice it's a painting. The more you start to read about Jonathan Edwards, the more you're going to understand he was a very sickly man. This picture is probably him kind of airbrushed, kind of like how we think of it, right? All those people on Instagram that kind of make themselves look 20 times better than they really look, right? I think that portrait is basically an airbrush of Jonathan Edwards. Jonathan Edwards was a kind of a sickly, broken down man. He wasn't real appeasing to the eye. I don't think many people in America in the evangelical church would probably hire him because he doesn't look super great. Because a lot of people get hired based upon how good they look, instead of what they're about. Jonathan Edwards wouldn't have really passed a lot of eye tests in our day. He actually was fired from his job at the end of his life because he took a position on the Lord's Supper that was out of step with the popular view of the day. I won't get into that specific thing called the half covenant controversy. I won't get into that. But basically, this is a man that took a lot of lumps in life. He had a lot of his kids died early in age, like early in childbearing years and things like that. But his wife was, he's a weird dude. His wife was so godly, he was like jealous of her. He was like jealous of his wife with how godly she was and like how much she knew God. He was like, wait, what? Like it's really strange if you kind of think about it. He was almost coveting her relationship with God. It's just kind of fascinating. He almost never left New Jersey, kind of the area we know now as New Jersey. He very rarely traveled. He wasn't a traveled person. He kind of stayed kind of at home a lot. He didn't move around a ton. He was one of the presidents of Princeton University Seminary, which is kind of what it's known now. He only was there for 6 months before he died. He actually died while he was president there. His life is fascinating and kind of in some ways very tragic. He was known, of course, to write the great biography of David Brainerd, the famous missionary to the New York and Canadian Indians. He's a fascinating, profound figure. He is really probably one of the greatest Christian theologians of all time. And most would say he's the greatest American Christian theologian. But he's weird. There's a lot of things about him that are really weird and eccentric, and some of his thinking is very strange the more you get to know him. But at the same time, there's a lot of things that he teaches that are like, oh, okay, I've kind of been taught that. So I won't get into all that. Because that's kind of beyond the scope of what we're trying to do here. But what I'm trying to tell you is God takes weirdos, okay? God takes in people that have all sorts of weird thoughts. Man, he wants us to conform our thoughts to the Word of God. But he's also open to creative people. And Jonathan Edwards is a very creative thinker, a very creative philosopher, and someone who had a lot of very strong opinions and strong convictions that has caught on in our day. And this is a guy that was alive in the 18th century. And he's actually fairly popular today. But he was a broken down man in a lot of ways. Very sickly, kind of a homebound personality. Someone who served in Northampton, Connecticut for a very, very long time and was relieved of his job at the end of his career when he should have been enjoying retirement. He was fired. And then they hired him again because they needed a pastor. Just talk about a dysfunctional relationship, right? So this is an interesting person. So biography by Ian Murray is probably the best one, I think, of all the biographies out there. And then 2 books, I would just say, if you want to know what he thought, his thinking, what he believed, there are 2 very good books. Both of them are introductory level books that I think a senior high kid could probably read just fine. But maybe, you'd probably need, whether me or someone else to kind of walk with you through that book a little bit if you have questions, because there's a lot in there that are like, what is he talking about? But I think these are very much, readable for high school kids or very heavy reading junior high kids, and certainly for adults and parents. So the first one is a book that came out just recently that has really received incredible attention positively for its take on Edwards, and also it's a republication of one of his famous articles called The End for Which God Created the World. And this is none other than John Piper's God's Passion for His Glory, okay? So, it's got a take on Edwards and his thinking, and then it's also got John Piper's thoughts on that article called The End for Which God Created the World. Kind of why did God make the world? Kind of like St. Augustine's, right? God made the world for himself, right? But it's Jonathan Edwards has an interesting take on that idea that is similar to that, but is a little creative. So that's a really, really good book. Very more readable, I think, than this next one. For those of you that are very interested in Jonathan Edwards' ideas, what does he think? Why is he different? Where is he creative? Read this book last year. Very, very good book by Kyle Strobel. And it's actually Lee Strobel's son, the one who's famous apologist. His son, Kyle Strobel, and Oliver Crisp. wrote this book called, I can't read here, Jonathan Edwards, An Introduction to His Thought, okay? An Introduction to His Thought. Very, very good. Like, what a cool little picture. Hello. Like, what a cool picture of Jonathan Edwards there, right? And that book is really helpful to understand both how he is not new in how he thinks. You know, he kind of follows in line with a lot of other Reformation thinking. And then the weird stuff comes out, all the weird things that he thinks about God and stuff that are, you know, I would say borderline problematic. But it's interesting to read, you know, it's interesting to read creative people, you know. So those are two books I think that might be helpful if you want to think through his ideas and how Jonathan Edwards' thinking kind of meshed with Christian history. And then that book by Ian Murray, you know, Jonathan Edwards, I'm sorry, this is kind of weird holding there. Jonathan Edwards' new biography, it's not new, it's from like 1988, but Jonathan Edwards' biography by Ian Murray is really probably one of the best. And I commend this person to you because his life was so uniquely Christian, filled with despair, filled with problems, filled with issues. His thinking was off in places. His thinking was profound in other places. He lived most of his life in one place. He was entranced by the world and kind of how it looked and the natural sciences and things like that. He's just an interesting figure, but his thoughts are so profound. His understanding of who is God is Father, Son, Spirit, is really, really, really interesting. So I commend to you Jonathan Edwards on Getting to Know series.